When they say a convict they wanted to turn into one of their snitches, usually a young, new inmate, a guard would approach him. At the start, the kid wouldn't go for it. Then came the convincing. They'd throw him in cell block 5 with the hardcore cons who beat him and rape him. When it was all over, the captain or lieutenant would come back and offer their protection. You do what we need you to do, and we'll keep those guys off your back. If the fish still refused, they put a false snitch jacket on them, their favorite payback to convicts they either didn't like or who wouldn't work with them. They let the word slip out to population that the con had been talking to them, knowing the other inmates would jump to the conclusion that it was true. Enraged as they were by their circumstances and at the man, most convicts were happy to have some scapegoat to vent their anger on. They wouldn't sit down and figure out whether the dude really snitched on someone or if the man was fucking with them. They just assumed the son of a bitch had been talking. Then the guy was in trouble and 50 convicts were ready to get on his case with fists and shanks. He couldn't fight 50 men, so he had to leave population and stay locked up in the protection unit with a reputation he hadn't earned. Only men with basically weak constitutions who didn't want the stamina to stand up to the punishment the man would dish out wound up snitching. But as much as the convicts gave the snitch a hard time, they understood that half the blame went to the upholders of the law, the so-called rehabilitators of the criminal mind, who used their positions of power to manipulate and intimidate an inmate into betraying his friends. Nor did the man have any respect for his informers or offer them solace or reward when their usefulness was ended. Once a snitch was found out by the rest of the population, it was a lonely life. If he was lucky enough to avoid getting killed, his name was forever mud. He had to spend the rest of his time locked up day and night, knowing he was despised by everyone, guards and inmates alike. Like the snitches, Deputy Warden Montoya had the distinction of being despised by both inmates and guards. The officers would openly complain to us about him, mainly because he treated them as badly as he treated convicts. If a guard wasn't playing footsies with the clique, Montoya would give him the royal shaft by shifting him to tower duty or some equally obnoxious work detail. In some cases, Montoya made things so intolerable for the officer that he'd be forced to resign, as happened in one well-publicized incident involving a 27-year-old newcomer to the penitentiary. The way Officer Bruce Podlesny told the story, he saw a window one day with broken glass in it, just hanging there, splintered, and knocked it out to prevent someone from cutting themselves or using the glass as a weapon. Someone, no doubt a friend of the clique, reported him for breaking the window, and Podlesny was called down to Montoya's office to explain. According to Podlesny, Montoya tagged him a psycho and said he didn't believe the officer had broken off already splintered glass from just 4 or 5 panes. He believed Podlesny had actually smashed all 35 panes of glass in the window. Montoya gave him a choice: resign, in which case his employment record would remain clean and he wouldn't have to pay for the window, or be fired and pay for it. Podlesny resigned, but $157 was still deducted from his last paycheck. Payment for the window he insisted he never broke. Montoya denied Podlesny's story, insisting that he'd never accused the officer of being a psycho or of breaking a window. We counseled him in reference to the window breaking, he told reporters, but he didn't recall the circumstances surrounding his termination or resignation. Nor did he know anything about the guard's final check and the deduction made on it because he said, "My concern is programs." A group of guards, however, backed up Podlesny's version of the event and used it to exemplify their own dissatisfaction with working under Montoya. You have your little fiefdoms out there. Employees who make mistakes on the job are disciplined if they're on the outs with the power structure, but get off scot-free if they're tied to a clique. They explained to the reporter that they were talking so they could get the public's attention and induce the corrections department to give the officers more training and more chance for advancement. Only 30% of the corrections staff had received formal classroom training, and even in Rodriguez's time, training to be a warden was non-existent. Actually, by 1979, there was more formal training offered to the guards than ever before. But because the prison was understaffed, few newcomers and old-timers could be spared from duty so they could attend these classes. In addition to this formal study, new officers were supposed to receive a basic orientation during their first week on duty, but some guards reported that the program was little more than a tour of the penitentiary. If you're lucky, a fellow officer will show you what you have to do if he has time, one guard told the Attorney General's investigators. Another veteran officer told them that his best initial instruction on key and grill handling came from the inmates. The man in charge of keeping the corrections officers on their toes was another old-time clique member. He was as lax in enforcing security procedures as he was careless in his treatment of inmates. During the 17 years on the rise from guard to superintendent of correctional security, he proven himself to be one of the least sympathetic officers in the penitentiary. He never took time to talk to an inmate, regardless of the problem at hand, and if he had, it would have been to a fellow Chicano because he could barely speak English. It was during his term as security chief that so many escapes occurred and the 1980 riot exploded. If anyone had been concerned about how the prison was being managed, they would have seen he wasn't taking care of business. Only after the riot did the laziness he allowed begin to surface. In the words of one of the officers under his command, for 16 hours a day and on weekends, the place was run by captains who made a lot of accommodations, causing rampant inconsistencies. At least half the time when I walked into the place in the morning, we were not flying the colors. Now, you may not be able to relate that to basic security procedures, but I do. Something is done every day, all the time, because it's supposed to be done. Given this lack of supervision, the guards had the power to act on their own and lock up the convicts for any infraction they could dream up. And they dreamed up some humdingers. Inmates were sent to lock up for walking down the wrong side of the corridor, for lying on their bunks after morning wake-up call, or for taking crackers out of the kitchen. One prisoner was sent to lock up because he cut his finger and smashed it while unloading trash in the dump site. Lockup was so prevalent, a punishment there was triple bunking in cell block 3, while in cell block 4, protection, where there should be only one cell, there were two. Why? Because the snitch circuits were so carelessly used that informants were being found out as they were fingered. Why? Because the snitch circuits were so carelessly used that informants were being found out as soon as they fingered someone. None of this helped to calm the mounting rage of the inmates, nor was there any help from top management. The warden was never available to anyone, and Deputy Warden Montoya was a lost cause as far as the inmates were concerned. This man was never straight with the convict. Someone would stop him and ask for a job change or say he needed to talk to him about something important, and Montoya would say, "Sure, I'll get to you this afternoon, or I'll call you in the morning." That would be the end of it. The inmate would never hear. A week later, he'd see Montoya again and ask what happened to the meeting he'd promised. Montoya would look at him like he didn't know what the dude was talking about and tell him he never said any such thing. He demonstrated no interest in the well-being of the prisoners. His whole framework was one of force and security gained through the fear he and his officers could evoke in a man. Many of the prisoners felt that Montoya was blatantly prejudiced against whites and blacks, especially those who belonged to the cliques. Inmates believed that he would lock up members of the Aryan Brotherhood on the slightest provocation, and they felt that he had even less use for the black Muslims, while it seemed he'd bent over backwards for his brother Chicanos. When 6 Chicanos jumped one white inmate, beating and raping him, and the white con turned them in, Montoya had no choice but to lock the Chicanos up. The next day, though, he gave them more slack than he'd ever given a white or black. He called them into his office and asked if they'd done what they were accused of. Naturally, they said no. 6 against 1, that's good enough for me, Montoya told them. I can't see any reason to hold you guys in lockup anymore. They were freed from lockup in just 1 day. A few weeks later, however, he had no qualms about holding a group of whites and 1 black in lockup for weeks, in spite of a report from one of his own officers that there were no grounds to do so. There were other actions of Montoya's that triggered the February riot, in particular one that centered on mail-in visitation. A few jailhouse lawyers had filed lawsuits to secure improvements in certain prison conditions. After 2.5 years for the courts to take action on this suit, the Duran Decree, a partial consent decree, was signed in the fall of 1979. It ordered the implementation of increased mail-in visitation privileges that in the joint are life breath to an inmate. When the court order came through, Montoya took his mean, slow time instituting these new policies. This infuriated the convicts, many of whom were clique leaders who'd worked hard and waited a long time to see the fruits of their efforts. Another trigger that made the prison blow apart was the insidious work going on in the Psychological Services Unit. Dr. Mark Orner, the psychologist heading the unit, was also a member of the man's clique. His actions during his time at the penitentiary had earned him the animosity of the inmates, which they expressed during the riot by burning down the Psych's unit with particular vigor. As a former inmate told reporters, the overkill and butchery you saw during the riot was one of rage, and the rage was from the stress in that prison. And it's my opinion that the Psychological Services Unit added to that stress more than it reduced the rage. Like the other clique members, Dr. Orner played one inmate off against another. In addition, his evaluations of a convict had a great amount of pull with the parole board, and he used the fact to gather information. If a man didn't tell him what he wanted to know, Orner would tell the board the con wasn't ready for society yet. Since, as a psychologist, he was thought to have a special talent for understanding human nature, the board went along with his opinion 99% of the time. The Psychological Services Unit was started in 1973. Most of the convicts thought it was a big joke and a waste of money. They had no respect for Orner from the get-go. And as time went on, no trust in him or his counselors. They knew Orner's staff reported back to him, and they weren't about to unburden their feelings so he could ruin their records if he didn't like what he heard. When new inmates would mistakenly go to the counselors for help in handling the jungle they were facing for the first time, the advice they were given was the same they would have gotten from a guard or administrator. Go on back and tough it out. Even if Orner and his staff had been willing to honestly work with the problems a man faces in the penitentiary, where would they begin? Convicts aren't about to unload to the man when their entire day-to-day existence deals in secret plots to get around the administration, nor are they likely to confide in a psychologist who is a member of the Punishment Dealing Segregation Committee, as Orner was. The psychological problems in prison can't be solved by talking about them anyway. It's prison itself that breeds paranoia, depression, and aggressive feelings. Dr. Orner was only a doctor of psychology. Though he denied it, reports always managed to circulate that he was strongly opposed to the hiring of a psychiatrist. When a team of forensic healthcare consultants for the American Civil Liberties Union came to the penitentiary in 1979 to inspect the medical facilities, the psychiatrist in the group quoted Dr. Orner as telling him, "I'll leave if a psychiatrist comes here." Orner told me that he had spent 7 years building up his psychological services staff and that he did not want any outsiders threatening his position or his staff's credibility. According to his team of consultants, Dr. Orner and his psychological services unit never supplied adequate care for the mentally ill, who made up 10% of the prison population. Because these psychotic inmates were thrown in the dormitories with the mainstream of convicts, they were cause or victim of nearly half the violent incidents within the penitentiary and usually would end up in the hole for indefinite periods of time without the benefit of the therapy or tranquilizers their condition demanded. What little counseling they did receive consisted of one of Orner's aides walking by their windowless cell door asking a brief, "How's everything today?" Dr. Orner and the prison's medical director both had antipathy in psychiatry, psychiatrists, and the use of psychotropic medication, including major tranquilizers, the latter being standard treatment for psychotic and schizophrenic disorders. The forensic unit of the state hospital in Las Vegas, New Mexico, where these mentally ill convicts should and would have gone were it not so overcrowded, wrote to this team of medical consultants that prisoners arrive from the penitentiary in a ketonic state, and it is obvious they are receiving no treatment. They cited as an example one prisoner who was considered a raving lunatic and transferred to Las Vegas. Through the use of L'Occitane, an antipsychotic, he reached what doctors described as a stable remission, stable enough for him to be sent back to the penitentiary. When he returned there, he was given no medication, even though it had been prescribed, and soon became floridly psychotic again. Some of those inmates whose mental balance went awry managed to escape their suffering by killing themselves. Between 1968 and 1977, there were 7 successful suicides in the prison, and in the following year, between June 1978 and May 1979, several more suicide attempts were recorded. Those who tried but didn't succeed were placed in lockup or in special dungeon. Those who tried but didn't succeed were placed in lockup or in a special dungeon hole near the gas chamber in the basement of cell block 5, where no guards were stationed and no one could hear their constant screams to be set free. Others, who were more violently suicidal, were treated to one of the most bizarre procedures in prison history: a plaster body cast from neck to ankles with holes for defecation and urination. This restraint was developed in 1978 by the penitentiary's medical director as an alternative to drug therapy. As he explained to the team of forensic consultants, he thought it was probably more humane to physically restrain people than to make them suffer the effects of some tranquilizers. His premise is voided by the fact that Thorazine had to be forced down a fit-throwing convict's throat to get him into the body cast. Dr. Orner spoke about his use of these casts at a meeting of the American Medical Association's Conference on Health Services in Correctional Facilities in November of 1979. He told his audience that he was using body casts as a method of crisis intervention, and he did it in almost a bragging tone. He sounded like he thought it was terrific. One listener, an attorney with the New York Legal Aid Society, commented, "I asked him how he got people into it, considering that they would be supposedly violent people in some kind of episode. And he said that if it took 6 officers, 8 officers, it didn't matter how many it took to hold the guy down. But according to an interview with the next inmate who was placed in a body cast in the summer of 1979, it was Thorazine, not the guards, that subdued him. I was brought down to the hospital in handcuffs and thrown off into the strip cell a number of times. Finally, they upped and stuffed me off in that old cast situation, but before they did that, they poured Thorazine down my throat. Held my jaws right there and just poured it right down my face because I didn't want to take it. Well, after I got in that full body cast, I busted all out of that, man, because I was hysterical, scared. Somebody's trying to kill me." A psychologist from an East Coast mental health unit who treated this man before he'd gone into the Land of Enchantment's prison told reporters he seriously deteriorated while in the New Mexico State Pen. He came back much worse than when he went out there. He returned totally schizophrenic. Punishment was the prison's going treatment for insanity. When a psychotic, mentally disturbed convict was brought before a segregation committee, which included psychologist Mark Orner, the man who would be treated like he'd done something wrong, sent to lockup or stripped naked and thrown in the hole, or worse yet, the dungeon hole near the gas chamber. All his privileges were taken away. No canteen, no visits, no television. 5 of the inmates killed in the February 1980 riot were mentally ill. 1 was Juan Sanchez, who died in the hole. 2 were in the protection unit, cell block 4, 1 in cell block 3, and the other was new enough to the prison to still be living in population. They were killed because none of the prisoners understood their insanity any more than the administration did. Do you know why it's so hard to treat the mentally disturbed prisoners at the state pen? A former New Mexico prison psychologist asked rhetorically, then aptly answered, because it's the institution that has a character disorder.